I'm calling it 10 Ignatian tips for mental health. So Ignatian just means from St. Ignatius of Loyola. So it's a particular style of spirituality connecting to God from the Jesuits, obviously the Jesuit tradition. But Ignatian is the broader sense. Everybody that is in the Ignatian family, everybody that finds that way helpful. So I just offer it as helpful things you might find useful. So it's about mental health. It's a topic, obviously, and mental health is something that, I mean, we all have it. We all face it. We all have moments. We all try to keep it on track. We all try to work at it, And I find this a helpful little diagram in the sense of there's like a continuum, like a scale. Sometimes we're in the green and we're doing really well, and sometimes it can go back to the red, which is the crisis here. And often we go between those things, and often some things we find are helpful, some things we need to do. We can have difficult moments, we can get up again and move on, etc. So I think everybody's in this kind of scale. We can be doing really well or be doing not so well, and it's possible to move. It's possible to move from one to the other, and it's possible to recover, and it's possible to get better and to improve your mental health. So it's a delicate balance sometimes. So then this talks about spirituality. Obviously spirituality is just simply the connection to God, the relationship. And I see spirituality obviously as the key link, And I often talk about spirituality as like the glue that holds us together. This kind of almost like this invisible web that holds us together, that allows us to be coherent, to be well, to be functioning, to be relating. And it's that little piece that, if plugged in, can have a dramatic impact on the rest of our body. And we're not just disconnected kind of thought beings, or we are fully embodied. And St. John Paul II said we are embodied spirits. We're not like disconnected spirits. We live in a body, and that's really important. You can't ignore the body. And there used to be a negative thing that the body wasn't good, and we've had to recover that. The body is a key part of who we are. It's a gift from God, and we have to look after it and integrate it and work with it and pray with it, So then the context of the coronavirus obviously is where we find ourselves. And it is a huge challenge for mental health, I think, for all of us. It just happens to be the one thing that you would not want, to be isolated, to be disconnected from your peers, family, sometimes loved ones, from work, sometimes unemployment, uncertainty. That big word there is a terrible thing, not knowing what's going to happen, and the news is full of negativity, and it's really difficult. It's very stressful often. So just to be aware of that, maybe cut ourselves a bit of slack, maybe be aware of the media. They say that too much media, watching the news even can often be quite negative, so we have to try to protect ourselves sometimes. And then just simply, the coronavirus here can be a bit of a wrecking ball for our mental health. It can have quite a negative impact. So obviously just to be aware of that. I think everybody's in the same boat. We're all trying to do the best we can. A friend of mine that I work with has a great phrase: everybody's doing the best they can within the situation where they find themselves, So it just helps just to realize, this is a really tough time. People are having to dig really deep. Sometimes people lose it. So people do all sorts of irrational things, and people do silly things. You have to be compassionate with others, compassionate with ourselves. Something that comes from God that we need to have in ourselves. So then the 12 Ignatian tips. So I actually have 13. I sneaked in an extra one just last night, so I didn't want to put 13 up though, just in case. So I have 12. So the first one, Christine said at the beginning that I love nature. So obviously nature is a key thing, a key part of the world, but it's also a key part of who we are. There used to be this thing that nature was somehow different to us or outside of us, and it's very much a kind of a modern thing, capitalist, materialist thing, that nature is just something there to be used, and it doesn't have any value. And this is where a lot of the ecological crisis comes from. And of course, we are made of nature. We are made of soil and earth and carbon and elements, etc. And nature is God's creation. They often talk about nature is the fifth gospel. It's the fifth gospel because it is God's work. World. It is this thing of great beauty, and I mean, it's quite fragile, obviously, what we're seeing at the moment, but it has this extraordinary ability to connect us to God. So even something just as simple as getting outdoors, and even with the lockdown, you're still allowed to walk, obviously, so just simply walk. And this is my morning walk around the local park, and there are these moments of beauty, even in the rain, even in the difficult times, stormy weather. You get these beautiful moments which helps us to remember who we are. Remember, created by God. It's this fundamental thing we have to hold on to really tight, because we can forget. You can forget. You can get caught up in yourself, our own little world. Locked up in my room, seeing the four walls. So to get out, and even just to walk. I'm a big Camino pilgrimage person, and just walking has a tremendous ability to reconnect us with ourselves, to work through problems, to let things fall off of us, just simply walking. I remember when my brother died, I did the Camino de Santiago, the 500 miles, and I just walked for 5 weeks, Just helpful, beautiful thing. To be in nature is such a healing thing. The second one is to get some distance from your feelings. So this says that feelings are something you have, not something you are. So that's really crucial, to get a bit of distance on your feelings, not to be overwhelmed by them, or not to identify yourself too closely with them. So often you see people say, I am depressed, as if that was all I was. The more accurate to say, I am feeling depression at this particular. Even feeling joy, even feeling happiness, it's something that I feel just for a moment. And I sometimes you can't hang on to those things. You can't define yourself in terms of that. So to get a bit of leeway on your feelings, and I remember the meditation Christine did there just a few minutes ago was quite helpful. To notice that there is a gap between us and our feelings, in order to get a bit of distance, in order not to let the feelings overwhelm us, in order not to be swept along. If I feel bad, then I start to act in negative ways, and it's a snowball effect because I identify too closely with the feelings. So a lot of prayer, meditation, good mental health is about separating yourself. This is where the mindfulness is particularly helpful, because it's that I'm more than my feelings, and that there is a gap between myself and my feelings, and I can let feelings go at times. I'll just come back to that later, but just talking about prayer, meditation. This is another key one: to manage anxiety or fear. This is a picture I took on a dock, obviously, of a rope, and it just captures that sense of anxiety and fear. You get wrapped up in a knot, and the tension and the sense of feeling that in your body somewhere. And at the bottom there is a blog myself and a friend wrote, trying to address anxiety, how to address that, how to pray with that. But sometimes we canonize anxiety and fear. It takes over us, and we let it drive us, and it's a desperate boss. It's a tyrant. To let it run the show is to hand your whole life over to it. That's not to say that it's easy to disconnect from that. Obviously, it's one of the most difficult things, to disconnect from anxiety and fear, and not to let it rule. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work, like psychologically, emotionally, not to be caught up in it. Physically, in our bodies, remember, not to be letting that rule the show. To be aware that there's anxiety operating is often a very useful thing. And then finally, spiritually, is to recognize it for what it is. It's not a good thing. It's not the thing that should be driving us. Love and compassion are the things that are from God. So to clearly identify it in your prayer, and to pray for what you need to release from something that's not helpful, And don't be canonizing it. Like I say, don't be accepting it as this thing that I'm going to let rule my life, you know. And in the Jesuit system, you ask for the grace you need. You beg, you ask and demand for what you want. There's release from this thing, you know. Number 5, just notice my numbering is out of killed. So it's going to be 13 after, it's going to be 12 after all. So this is just trying to filter your thoughts. And again, it's the same thing about not letting our thinking take over. This is a really common thing in today's world, that people live in their heads and people live in their thoughts, you know, and not in their bodies and not in the wholeness of who we are. And again, it's a real trap, and it's quite difficult to catch yourself sometimes because it's so overwhelming, you know. And there's a philosopher to blame for this, is Descartes, who's like the father of modernism, which is this idea that I think therefore I am. You know, my thoughts are great, and if I get a clear and distinct thought, then it must be true, you know. And sometimes that can be devastating, you know. Think of a lot of people think I'm a bad person, you know. That thought just gets into their head and it takes over and it wreaks havoc. Imagine the devastating consequences. Do you have to address your thoughts? You have to recognize them and filter them and check them out against reality. Obviously, I'm talking about counseling here. Things like CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, is really good at this. It helps to identify, is this real? You know, is this actually located in reality? Or is this just my head is playing tricks with me? And to get a grip on these things and to wrestle them to the ground, you know, to wrestle these false thoughts and corrosive thoughts. Again, I appreciate this is difficult, you know, but it's part of the thing we have to deal with. Number 6, exercise regardless. So you can see this animal, whatever it is there, is just lying on the tree. And I often come across this in my job as spiritual director, and somebody would say, you know, I don't feel well enough to do exercise, or I don't feel good, so I'm just gonna stay in, or I'm not gonna do anything. It's a massive trap, obviously. You know, I don't feel well, therefore I don't exercise, therefore I feel worse. One of the rules is exercise regardless of how you feel, you know. Just get out there. And there's this great rule from the Camino that I learned, and it's just simply get up out of bed and get walking, you know. And don't start thinking about things early in the morning, because that's when you overthink things, you know. You get into a bit of a fog. And like even a simple tip, like put your exercise gear on the chair beside the bed and get straight into it and get straight out, you know. For me, I do a walk every morning, first thing, before the head starts to kick in, before the rationalization, before all the thoughts come in, you know. Get your body going. Works for me, you know, and it's sound psychology, you know. Our bodies are important. We can overthink things, and even just simply walking, I'm talking about gentle exercise here. Simply walking will help you to get back into your body and to be present to yourself, which is the key thing. Finding God in the Mess. Christine mentioned this already. It's the name of a book Jim Deeds and myself wrote, which we found was speaking to people. Obviously, what happens is when you're in a mess or a difficult situation, the whole COVID crisis, people tend to think, well, my God has left me, you know, God has abandoned me. And think of that phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me? Remember what Jesus said on the cross? He's pointing at a real human experience. When I'm going through a tough time, when I'm walking in the darkness, it feels like I'm alone. Jesus said this on the cross, and it's an apparent absence of God. And the key thing is to do what Jesus does. You pray your way through that difficult situation. You find the words, you use the Psalms. Remember, Jesus said, you know, take this cup away from me. Not my will, but your will be done. You find the words to express what you're going through. And sometimes we can't avoid the mess. You can't avoid the COVID mess. We can't think it away, you know. There's this phrase a psychologist told me one time that a lot of young people use, and it's, if only I wasn't here, I wouldn't be experiencing this. If only I wasn't here, I wouldn't be experiencing this. Can you hear that? It's a mental trap. It's trying to think your way out of a difficult situation. If only I wasn't here, imagine myself somewhere else. And it's like totally pointless and not helpful, And it's the head trying to solve a problem that you can't do that way. So accepting the reality, finding God in the reality. And Pope Francis has a great phrase. He says, God is in the real and not in the ideal. The ideal can be a real trap. We try to think ourselves out of it. We look for perfection where there is none. And we imagine that God is somehow only in the perfect and the ideal and the great days and the sunshine and the beaches and sunshine. It's not like that. God is with us always, remember? God is always with us. God walks with us even in the darkness. God carries us sometimes when it gets really tough. There's one set of footprints in the beach because God is carrying us. These are important things to hold on to, especially when you're in the mess. To remember to pray, remember to step back, remember to reflect, remember God is with you. Number 8, accept your humanity. And this is a difficult one. To be human is a paradox. It's not just one thing. The paradox is, I am human, I am embodied, I am physical, I suffer, I have difficulty, I cry, I laugh, and also the Spirit dwells within me. Remember, so we have this spiritual dimension to our lives, but the two things exist in this kind of tension. And often people choose one side or the other. They want to resolve the tension of the paradox. The paradox is an apparent contradiction. And we have to hold these things in tension, accept the complexity of who we are. So I often say to people, we are brilliant, we are talented, and also we are wounded or we are broken. And often these two things exist together. And also we need God's Spirit and God's strength to guide us, to get us through difficult situations. Often people can have a bit of a breakthrough moment. I know myself, in grief or something, when you reach the very end of your tether, when you reach these really dark moments and you realize I can't go on, and then you start to pray, and it's not just words, it's the real thing. It's the real connection with God. It's the real belief and trust, and it's the real words that trying to express what's going on and trying to plead and demand and beg for God's help. And those sort of moments are often breakthrough moments that break through false ways of praying. And often I see in spiritual direction, people make a deal with God. They have this deal, please God, look after me and I will keep the rules, as if God is going to protect you from these difficult things. And then whenever things go wrong, then you blame God. Why did you let this happen to me? As if God is going to intervene miraculously and fix your world and keep you happy and safe. So sometimes these moments test us and purify us, especially purify our faith, or our notion of God, notion of humanity, who we are. Number 9, keep going, the routine. You see the oil rig here, and you see the platform, the supports that it's built on. Those are the key things, the supports, the anchors. And we have to anchor ourselves, and it takes a while to build those supports. So things like, obviously, exercise, diet, my job, my routine, the things that I normally do, my family, my relationships, my prayer, my connection with God, the people I have that support me, maybe a counselor, maybe the health service, my doctor, etc. All these things are supports. Everybody has to have them. We don't exist alone. We're not islands. We're not independent, individuals. Even though that is often promoted as a great thing, but that's not who we are. We are about relationship fundamentally. We need other people. We need supports. We need help. Number 10, talk to someone. It sounds so easy, and yeah, it's so fundamental, obviously, to have someone we can talk to. Obviously, the lockdown makes this really difficult, and sometimes you have to find ways, like the Zoom, like the talking through a window. Like often I would go out for a walk with friends. We keep the distance, but we can still talk, to make the connection. But some way of talking, of expressing what's happening, and it has a huge impact, a positive impact on our mental health. And I always say to people, ask for help. I obviously I saw this with my brother, who never asked for help, and then I thought, you know what, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to ask for all the help that I'm going to ask for every single help there's going, and don't be afraid. It's not a stigma. You're not weak. It's actually the greatest wisdom is to know when to ask for help, and to do it promptly and quickly, and to get it. So that's a really important question for all of us. Am I isolating myself? Am I actually asking for what I need? Am I making my needs known here? Number 11, protecting the weak spots. This is the image of a castle, and it's this kind of idea about spiritual combat. That often God is working with us and protecting us and looking after us, but there's also another force that's negative, that's trying to undermine us. And St. Ignatius uses the image of a castle, and the castle has these ramparts and great protections, etc. And the rule is, this sounds really obvious, the rule is if you don't get attacked at the front, where all the protection is, and the great walls, and the high doorways and everything, you get attacked at the back where the weak spots are. So the enemy of our nature, our human nature, sneaks around and finds the weak spot, that drain at the back door left open. And the good news is, all you have to do is check your weak spots to know where you're likely to be falling down. So if I'm a perfectionist, for example, that's going to be it. It's going to be being too demanding with myself or others, looking for perfection. If I'm a procrastinator, if I put things off, that's going to be the weak spot. And that's what I have to work on. It sounds really odd. That's what I have to shore up. That's what I have to get help with. So you shore up your weak spots, and sure enough, that's going to be where the problems are going to be. That's where they're going to be coming in, and just simply reinforcing those weak spots is going to have a tremendous positive impact. And it's good news. The castle. The other thing is that the human being is a castle, and you're always going to be a castle, even if you're overrun. You can always recover the integrity of the castle. Remember, you can always come back to who you are, who you're meant to be, and who you are in God's eyes. So never give up, and never think that you don't have options, because you always have options. One of the signs of desolation, or in Ignatian terms, is desolation is the absence of God. The sign of desolation is thinking you have no options. Remember, once you start to get this in your head, oh my God, I have no options, there's no choice, I have no way out of this, that's a sign that the enemy of human nature is working on you there, trying to pretend there's no option, that there's nothing you can do. There's always choices, there's always something you can do. You got to figure out what that is. Remember, we are instruments in God's hands. We're not just simply empty vessels. We have agency, we have responsibility, we have ability to change and transform situations, and connecting to that can be really empowering. And trying to connect to God, obviously find out what could I do would be really helpful here. Number 12, talking about boundaries and helping. Just this friend of mine had a great story about if somebody's in a hole, the last thing you do is you don't get in the hole with them, right? It's really obvious. If somebody's in a hole, don't get in the hole with them. You tie yourself to a tree first, and then you help them get out of the hole, right? This guy here is trying to help. He's in a really vulnerable position because he's no support, and his back is bent over. And this is often what we do. I mean, I find this myself sometimes with family, etc. You give too much, and you leave yourself vulnerable, and you don't look after yourself, and there's no self-care. Remember, one of the rules of life-saving, you have to protect your own position. Otherwise, you can't help someone. Otherwise, there's two people in the water, and there's two people going to drown, So that boundaries can be really tough, How far can I safely go, and who can I help? Who can I help really well, and how can I give the real help that's needed? And how can I know when to intervene and when to pull back, to recognize in myself where those limits are? It takes a bit of work sometimes. And remember, helping is good, but only up to a point. This is like another Ignatian thing. Not everything is good. things are good only up to a point, you know. So food is good up to a point. Alcohol can be good up to a point. Rest is good up to a point. And there's these moments where things change and they become not good. It's like a U-shaped curve. Things are good up to a point, and then they stop not being good. And you have to recognize when things stop being good, things start to go the other way, and don't just accept everything's good just because it looks good. Some things can seem really good, but actually be very misleading and very unhelpful, you know, and undermine your well-being and bring down your relationships. My number 13, which is actually number 12, obviously, but prayer and meditation. And obviously this is one of the key things. I think we all do this to some degree. And I always say to people, I see this in spiritual direction a lot. Prayer is a two-way communication process, right? It's two-way, not just one way, right? So it's not just my prayer. It's not just me, you know, putting it out there, asking. There has to be some kind of listening. Otherwise, it's not two-way communication. Otherwise, just one way. I mean, remember the idea is not that God doesn't want just simply people who pray or worship or adore. I mean, obviously it's a good thing to do, but God wants apostles and disciples and followers and agents and instruments. God wants people that do things, not just to sit back and say the words. Remember, God wants us to be responsive. God has a plan for us. God is trying to move us out of difficult situations. God is trying to bring us to better places. God is trying to make us more loving and more compassionate beings. God is trying to open up the world for us, to show us where God's will is. So this sense of open hands in the meditation, both asking and receiving and listening. So both talking and listening. So sometimes you have to change your prayer. You can't just keep doing the same thing. We often say you can't just keep praying in the same way if it's not working. You can't just keep doing the same thing. Sometimes God is inviting us to do things differently. Sometimes God is inviting us to let go of some ways of praying that can be unhelpful. Sometimes God is asking us to actually do things instead. Sometimes God is asking us to bring about changes. So that thing about building in some kind of listening and some kind of feedback and some kind of way of finding where God is leading me in my life. Often the Jesuit Ignatian thing is called reflection, which is sitting back and looking at experience. So I have an experience. Maybe it's just simply my day, my experience of being in lockdown, being isolated. And I have to look back at that. I have to reflect on that experience in order to see what that means, in order to see where God is leading me, in order to see where the light is and where the darkness is in that. I need to get a bit of distance. So there's simple techniques. This examine technique is a Jesuit technique where you look back on your experience and you review it and you try to figure out what God is saying to me. That can be a really useful thing to do, as well as your normal prayer, this kind of reflection prayer, which leads to action, which leads to decisions, which leads to finding ways through difficult situations. So that's the end of my presentation. I have these questions for the small groups. So I think I'll hand you back at that stage. Thank you for listening. Hope I didn't bore you there. I hope I didn't get carried away too much either.